believe it really is real, and is there a lesson in it?
First of all, I don't know what gives things.
Well, no, I'm sitting in channel, but I didn't take on a crystal question, which I could have done, but I didn't go there.
As you know, I was at the Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe for 2 years as Director of Joint Operations for West Clark. I actually worked for 3 4-star generals, which is an interesting conundrum. 1 British, 1 German in West Clark. I had 250 officers from 19 nations working for me in shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and when the air war was on, almost 600. I had a lot of friends, Turks, Poles, Brits, Germans, Frenchmen, yes, Frenchmen. They even gave me a decoration. I knew I was finished at that point. But my point to you is that an unnamed Allied officer in Stan's headquarters sent me a message and said that this is a huge public relations operation in Marcia to try and persuade the US and British publics that progress is being made. In an area that frankly is strategically irrelevant, there's no Al-Qaeda connection there. Even this Taliban connection is distant. This is a narcotics center. But Afghanistan is a narco state. You know, Karzai's whole structure is based on narcotics. If you're interested in doing something, then you go to what is called Regional Command East or Regional Command South, where there are millions of people living. There are only about 50, 60,000 people living in and around Marshall. And if you go into those areas, then you're dealing with everything from Kandahar all the way up the border, and that's where you're going to find real hardcore opposition to you. But you've got to remember something, that when you begin to go into some of these areas, there are valleys in Afghanistan where you can lose 30,000 troops. Those vanish. The enormity of this country is beyond your comprehension. The notion that you're going to radically change anything is delusional. Now, if you're going to ask me then why are we doing it, you know, Einstein was once asked, you know, what's the difference between genius and stupidity? He said, genius has limitations. That's all I can say. John, are you picking here?
I read something in the Washington Post this morning where a woman said to her husband in some revelation, the Taliban don't have helicopters, do they? And the husband replied, the Taliban don't have socks. That was Gary Trudeau in Doonesbury, who I think sees more about what's going on than most of us in this room do. And it occurs to me that as you've made very plain, you as a military man come into a political situation after decisions are made and they are beyond you, you carry out your duty. But what remains unclear to me is why is it that we keep doing these things again and again? I began my career, I'm a journalist, I began my career after leaving the Marine Corps as a journalist in Vietnam. And from Vietnam I had gone to Cambodia, to Laos, to Bangladesh. I've covered wars everywhere, and most recently in Iraq. And I see us doing the same things again and again and again. Not necessarily, I'm not criticizing the military, though you've done a pretty good job of that yourself. I'm wondering why it is that we keep getting into these situations in countries that are fighting their own domestic, internal, or regional at best, problems out about which we know nothing. We understand not the situations, the cultures, the religions, etc. And where will it end?
Well, there are really 2 answers to your good question, and I'll give you 2 quick ones. George Kennan, who I've always regarded as an exceptionally brilliant man, very great man, quoted de Tocqueville, who observed that it was the habit in American foreign policy, which I think is quite an achievement for a Frenchman, and Tocqueville's 150 years ago, to do things in the foreign policy arena that are pleasing to the electorate at home. George Kennan ultimately said, what we do overseas is not really connected to any defined interests. The interests are all here inside the United States. So we have an audience. Now, this is going to sound harsh, but remember that you have a volunteer, what we call a volunteer force. I called the force that was with us in 1991 professional combat force, I really think it was. And I think a lot of good combat troops are professional soldiers. But the average American likes to sit in his barca lounge and wash away the time with 12-ounce doses of bad beer and watch television. And he sits there and somebody comes on and says, "They attacked us on 9/11. And he sits there and says, "Get those bastards, bomb them. Yeah, I like that." And then he switches the channel because what he's really interested in is Tiger Woods' extramarital affairs. So that's the first answer to your question. Okay, I can't change that. The second part of the question is a little more problematic, and that goes to the heart of the general officer problem. Somebody said to me a few years ago, who was a retired general, he said, "Doug, every administration wants a second term. Every general wants another star." I said, "That's the problem. There's always somebody willing to execute. No one is going to stand up and say no. That's the problem." I studied in Germany, 1969-70, and I have been back several times. I did my master's work over there. Speak German like a German, and the father of the family I lived with, had been in the German Wehrmacht, and as he said, did lots of interesting things, and then toured Russia for 4.5 years after the war. during which he learned to speak fluent Russian, by the way, along with good Georgian and excellent Turkish. Long story. But bottom line is that he would come to me and he would beat me over the head periodically because he knew I wanted to go to West Point. And he used to point to the events that happened before Stalingrad, where all of the generals that are commanding in the Southern Army Group are brought in to talk to Hitler. And Hitler wants to move towards Baku. And he wants to move on Stalingrad. And bear in mind that they had just discovered in August of 1942 a squad of German soldiers, 9 of them. They were all dead in their firing positions. They couldn't find any evidence for fire, for enemy contact. So they picked them up, they did an autopsy. The 9 German soldiers at the leading edge of the 6th Army on their way to Stalingrad had all starved to death. They had literally marched to their deaths for the Fuhrer. This information came back to all the senior generals. So a meeting was held, and Otto says, "We're going to Stalingrad. We're going here." One man in the meeting objected and said, "We must stop now. You know, men are starving to death. There's nothing out there. We've already destroyed the industrial facilities in Stalingrad from the air. Overextending to Baku is dangerous and a waste of time." One man, there were 9 generals in the room. The other 8 generals all agreed with him. And what did they say? Nothing. Nothing. They betrayed the men under their command and their country. Now, that's harsh. But let me fast forward to 2003, a month after Baghdad falls. Mr. Brenner shows up and announces to the assembled general officers commanding the divisions and corps, Army and Marine, that we are going to dismantle the Iraqi state. We are going to demobilize the Iraqi army. And Iraqi forces had been standing by, soldiers, with their officers, waiting for us to put them back on the streets of Baghdad. That's a fact, because I sat with battalion commanders of 3rd Infantry Division who told me that. And they kept telling them, wait, it'll work. McKiernan, the corps commander, was visited by a delegation of Iraqi army generals. Said, "We know you don't want me. I was a Saddam Hussein man, but here's a list of good colonels you can make generals who can take this army over right away, and they can go into the towns and villages, restore order, and they'll work with you." And Brenner announced this, and then he looked at the assembled generals, and he said, "Does everybody understand this is the policy of the United States?" And everybody nodded. And one man raised his hand and said, "But sir, I don't think this will work." He was a full colonel who retired as a full colonel. And he said, "This is a disaster. We're going to end up fighting these people. We can't do this." And one general, who was a 2-star at the time, at the end of the meeting said, "Well, downsizing's hard to do." They all got up and walked out. My point to you is very simple. Civilians are very much intimidated by military men. They really are. They think all these decorations are serious. Most of them are. Most of them are given by generals to each other. They see the uniforms, they're very impressed, and they're unwilling to challenge them. And that's unfortunate. But what I'm trying to get at is that if one 4-star says, "No,